Howdy and welcome to Chapter 7. In Chapter 7 we're going to be developing our assessment instruments. Some things we're going to go over in this chapter include the characteristics and components of various types of assessments, looking at testing formats and resources, applying design steps to create instruments, and then we're actually going to develop assessments based on the objectives that you developed last week. So here's where we are in the process. So at this point you've come quite a ways in the instructional design process. You may feel like you have by now. You assessed your needs, you wrote instructional goal statements, you analyzed your goal statements, and developed goal steps and sub-steps, subordinate skills, entry behaviors. You analyzed the learners, you analyzed the performance and learning context. And then in the last lesson, you wrote objectives for each skill in your instructional analysis. So the next step in the systematic instructional design process is to develop assessment instruments so you'll be able to determine if your learners have achieved your objectives. And here's a great quote from Robert Major. If it's worth teaching, it's worth finding out whether the instruction was successful. If it wasn't entirely successful, it's worth finding out how to improve it. It kind of sums up the whole assessment process, at least I think so. So as an instructional designer, the emphasis on assessments is a very important one, as performing appropriate and well thought out assessment helps us determine what objectives have or have not been learned by our learners, and also helps in performing formative evaluation. So if you think of objectives as describing where you're going, the assessment items are the means by which we're going to find out whether you got there. So you may wonder, why are we creating the test items now instead of creating the instructions? Well, the idea is that your assessment items should stem directly from your objectives. The performance asked for in the assessment item should match the performance described in the objective. They shouldn't be based on what you think are kind of good or fun test questions. They should also not be based on what your instructional activities are. The activities should be based on your objectives and assessment items. So the good thing is that if you've written good objectives, you already know what content to test for. It's just a matter of creating good test items that measure the acquisition of skills, knowledge, or attitudes that you're looking for. So different types of tests. Okay, I think the book talks about 3. I have 4 listed here. Entry behavior tests. An entry behavior test is given to learners before instruction begins, and it's designed to assess their mastery of prerequisite skills. So these are the skills that appear below the dotted line that you drew on your instructional analysis flowchart. So if you don't have any entry behaviors, you really don't need to worry about a pre-test. And we're not going to be doing a pre-test for our project, but I just want you to know that normally you would have to know this to be able to assess whether you need to do any remedial type training for some of your learners. A pre-test is different than the entry behavior test. A pre-test is used to determine whether learners have already mastered some of the skills in your instructional analysis. So if they have, there's not as much need for you to teach them those skills. So it becomes obvious that they lack certain skills. Then your instruction can be developed with enough depth to have them attain those skills. So when using a pre-test in this manner, you're not really trying to get a score that you can compare later to a post-test to tell gains. You're trying to determine how much they already know so you can spend time on the things they don't know. And we have practice tests. Practice tests solicit the learner's participation during the instruction and provides them a chance to rehearse the new skills being taught. It also allows you as an instructor to provide corrective feedback back to the learners and make sure that they're on track. Then we have post-test. The post-tests are given following the instruction, and this is what we're going to be working on for this phase of the project. We're going to be developing the post-test. So in this phase, we're trying to determine if the learners achieve the objectives we set out for them. So each item on the post-test should match one of your objectives, and the test should assess all of your objectives, and especially focusing on the terminal objectives. Okay. So post-tests are used by instructors to assess learner performance, to give grades, but for the designer, the primary purpose is to help identify the areas where instruction isn't working. So you as the designer are going to get feedback from the post-test. And you can tell if learners aren't performing adequately on your terminal objectives, then there could be something wrong in the instruction, and you may have to identify which areas aren't working and go back. Like I said, it's an iterative process. You have to keep going back once you get feedback and tweaking things and fixing things and trying things again. Okay, so when we do testing, we're always concerned with validity and reliability. And from an instructional design perspective, validity means that we're actually measuring what we're trying to set out to measure. Okay, so it consists of three things. Face validity means that it appears to measure what it claims to measure. Okay, and content validity measures an intended content area. Do we have the right content in there? Sampling validity represents knowledge and skills in an entire content area. And these things normally are validated by subject matter experts. Reliability tells us that it has consistency. Okay, so we're looking at internal consistency, whether it has consistency between the items within the test, like the items are sort of related to each other. Test retest tells us if it's stable across time. So any measure of reliability needs to be reliable through time and across people. And that's what inter-rater means, that two or more scorers get the same score. So we have consistency. Reliability is normally done through statistical testing. Okay, so types of assessment items, and there's a great table 2.5 in the book that goes through each one of these and tells you all about them, all the different things you need to know. Okay, so the first thing we want to look at is all these various items. Okay, and earlier we talked about different types of tests. Now we're talking about individual test items. Okay. So this is a good starting point if you look at table 5.2 of deciding what item type to use for a particular objective. However, when it comes right down to it, the wording of your objective really guides the selection of the item type. You should select the type of item that gives learners the best opportunity to demonstrate the performance specified in the objective. For example, if you have an objective for students to state the capital of Virginia, it would be best to have them state it from memory, like a fill in the blank, rather than pick it from a list of choices in multiple choice. So you can see how your objective needs to drive the type of test item. Okay. In addition to selecting the appropriate test item, it's also important to consider the testing environment. If your test items require special equipment or facilities as specified in the conditions component of your objective, then you'll need to make sure that those things are available to them. If not, you need to create a realistic alternative to test the item in an ideal situation. Okay, so then we want to match learning domain and item type. Okay, so we want to look at matching the learning domain with an appropriate item type. So organizing your objectives according to learning domain can help you select the most appropriate type of assessment. And If you remember, Gagné defined 4 main learning domains or categories. So verbal information, if we're looking at verbal skills, this generally calls for simple objective style test items like short answer, matching, multiple choice, true and false, that sort of thing. Intellectual skill objectives require either objective style test items, the creation of some product or performance of some sort, which would require a checklist of criteria. Okay, attitudes are a little bit more problematic since there's not usually a way to directly measure a person's attitudes. So assessment items generally involve observing the learners in action or having them complete their preferences on a questionnaire. And then psychomotor skills may require a checklist or rating scale so an instructor can determine if each step is done appropriately. Okay, so writing test items. So you should write an assessment item for each objective that you have in your analysis. So you want to read the objective, determine if it wants someone what it wants someone to be able to do. So you need to identify the performance. Draft a test item that asks students to exhibit that performance. Read the objective again and note the conditions under which the performing should occur. Okay, and that would be in your objectives. Write those conditions into your item. For conditions you can't provide, describe approximations. Get as close as you can. Sometimes you may need more than one test item per objective. Normally not, but if it's something where the range of conditions is so great that you need more than that, that's okay. If you follow these steps and you still find you're having trouble drafting an assessment item, it's probably because your objective isn't clear enough to provide the guidance. You may need to go back and tweak your objective a little bit if you're finding you're having trouble with this. Okay, so some criteria for writing test items. We have goal-centered criteria, and as we stated already, that the test items should be congruent with the terminal and performance objectives. Okay, so what this means is that each test item should measure the exact behavior and response stated in the objective. Okay, the language of the objective should guide the process of writing the assessment item. So a well-written objective will prescribe the form of test item that's most appropriate for assessing achievement of the objective. So appropriate assessment items should be able to answer yes to the following questions. You want to ask yourself, does the assessment item require the same performance of the student as specified in the instructional objective? Does the assessment item provide the same conditions as in the instructional objective? Okay, so you want to be able to say yes to those items in order for it to be okay. So why do we keep saying that performance indicated in the assessment item has to match performance in the objective? The point of testing is to be able to predict whether your learners will be able to do what you want them to do when they leave. Okay, so the best way you can do that is to observe the actual performance you're trying to develop. Okay, so learner-centered criteria. The test items have to take into account the learners. Are there issues with language levels, motivation, experience, backgrounds, cultural issues? Okay, and you did a learner analysis, so you should know those things. Context criteria. Okay, and this is why we did a context analysis. Okay, because we wanted to know about the environment. And we have assessment centered criteria. So test items need to be written very well. They can't have spelling or grammar or punctuation errors because these things tend to confuse the learner. Okay, and we don't want to put in tricky questions. We're not trying to trick them up because that's not really going to give us a clear picture whether they learned the material or not.